Hi, I'm Kip Davis. I'm a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I probably spend far too much time on YouTube, which led me recently to see a video on the Capturing Christianity channel that caught my attention. It's a presentation by this cheery-looking fellow, Michael Jones, who runs an apologetics website called Inspriring Philosophy. The title for his talk is The Reliability of Genesis 1 to 11. Now, this is admittedly a little out of my own wheelhouse, but I really like Genesis and Pentateuchal narrative. I've had the opportunity to teach classes on these texts in the past, and truly relish the chance to explore the fascinating and multi-layered traditions behind them. So, when Jones and Capturing Christianity put on a full-hour talk about some of the most interesting content in the Bible, you better believe I was ready and eager to see what they had to say. Unfortunately, despite the accumulation of numerous bits of data to make his case, I found this video frustrating. Not only does it strawman scholarly positions on the formation of the Pentateuch, but it also appears to follow from a complete failure to understand the source theories of biblical composition more generally. This is nothing new for evangelical scholars, but with this video, I felt it necessary to respond and set the record straight about Genesis. At the outset, Michael Jones says that his 132 slide presentation is an accumulation of small pieces of evidence that make a strong case for the historical reliability of Genesis.
What I'll say is what I get from a lot of skeptics is when I start going through this data is they'll take one piece of the data and go, well, that doesn't really amount to much. Yeah. Individually, all these pieces I'm going to go over are not going to amount to much. My argument is that collectively, together, they make sort of like a big punch. These all work together to argue that Genesis is old, reliable, goes back to a very ancient time, and it is internally consistent, so it probably wasn't this sort of documentary hypothesis, which we'll get into later.
Now, I can readily agree that individually, the points raised to make his case don't amount to much, and as such, most of them can be ignored. Jones spends a fair bit of time arguing from various bits, such as place names, the appearance of a few Akkadian cognates, parallels to ancient occupations, literature, and numbering systems to make his overarching point that Genesis 1 to 11 belongs more comfortably in the Bronze Age than it does in the post-exilic period. At one point, he showed how the geological description of Eden in Genesis 2 could reflect the very ancient topography of the Fertile Crescent and the occurrence of a flood, albeit a flood that was local and protracted over a long period of time. So I can concede all sorts of these small observations, and in some sense I agree. Yes, there are plenty of elements within the first 11 chapters of Genesis which indicate at least a memory of a very distant past. But why does this matter? And what does it mean? Jones attempts to marshal from a large collection of these small features an argument for the unity and antiquity of all of Genesis. How ancient? Well, at one point he indicates a belief that Genesis was written during the reign of Solomon, that is, sometime before 900 BCE.
Why could it not be dated a little bit later? Honestly, I would put Genesis during the monarchy of Solomon, or David maybe, because I think that would, given themes that come in Genesis 12 and after, I think it better fits with that time period.
In fact, some scholars readily recognize that portions of Genesis may go back this early. But what is significantly problematic for Jones's larger take here is what he has either ignored or flat out gotten wrong, and which rather forcefully mitigates against both of his two strong points. No, Genesis is not internally consistent. And no, Genesis as a whole did not exist at the time of Solomon. So, without countering all of his individual points, I've chosen to focus on those which essentially invalidate his case. I am presenting these in 3 sections, which I envision to comprise 3 individual videos. In this first one, I will point out a number of the outright errors which don't serve Jones's cause. In the second video, I will address problems created by the false dichotomy of options that he has provided for dating Genesis, and also his straw man depiction of the scholarly position on the construction of Genesis from material written over a longer period of time. Finally, in the third video, I will provide a discussion about the documentary hypothesis and the evidence for how we know about the transmission and dating of the Pentateuch. So, let's begin. There are small errors in Jones' presentation, most of which don't really amount to anything meaningful, but some of these do illustrate, I think, a general sloppiness in some of his research. Most particularly, I'm bothered by the seeming inability of his program to write properly in Hebrew. In his discussion about divine snake beings in the Hebrew Bible, Jones shows several slides that have the Hebrew word saraf used to describe these creatures, but written backward. That's better. This happens again in a later slide where he discusses the headwaters of the 4 rivers in Genesis 2:10 and has typed the Hebrew word rosh backwards. I mean, why even bother if you can't type it correctly? Speaking of the magic snakes that appear in the Hebrew Bible,
I also want to talk about the word for seraphim, that we see. So think of Isaiah 6. God is surrounded by the seraphim when Isaiah has this great vision of God up on his throne and whatnot. Now, interestingly enough, seraph is another run-of-the-word mill for like a poisonous or a fiery serpent. It's not just a word for an angelic being, it's also a word for serpent. And you could basically see it probably actually comes from the Egyptian word. So Trygve Medinger notes there is now an emerging consensus that the Egyptian Uriah serpent is the original source of the seraphim motif.
Jones's entire point here is to ground the seraphim from Isaiah 6 in the archaeological parlance, but also to connect these creatures to the serpent in Genesis 3, and then to show allusions of ancient Egyptian snake motifs drawn from the pyramid text and the story of the snake in the Garden of Eden.
There seems to be far more interesting connections there. Now that would be available, obviously, to Moses, who would have been serving in the court there at that time period. And I'm not saying he sort of just copied it. I'm saying there were similar theological themes between the Egyptians and the Israelites in terms of the existence of these otherworldly serpents and how you're supposed to deal with them.
So Jones is correct about the similarities between some of these connections, but I think he overstates the closeness of serpent traditions to the ancient Egyptians at the expense of other surrounding cultures. The truth is, serpents were extremely common as divine symbols throughout the ancient Near East. But beyond this point, Jones also makes a series of errors, in particular in how he understands the Hebrew word saraf, on which he attempts to build his case. First, remember that Jones has said that the Hebrew word came from the Old Egyptian word urias. This is not true. The word saraf also appears in Ugaritic and Akkadian, as well as much later Egyptian Aramaic. So, while the concept of a flying divine serpent being was shared by the Egyptians, the word itself most certainly did not stem from an Egyptian word. Jones makes another error here by identifying the creature specifically in Numbers 21:6-8 and Deuteronomy 8:15 as seraphim. They are not. Rather, these are the Han-Hoshim Hasforim, where the Hebrew word saraf is an adjectival modifier for the noun nachash, which also means serpent or snake.
Now think about Genesis 3. Was it a talking snake? Yes and no. It was a talking snake, but it wasn't a gardener snake or a king cobra. It was an otherworldly serpentine being.
Except the serpent in Genesis 3 was not a Sodaf. It was a Nachash. To my mind, the existence of magic, otherworldly, serpentine beings does not in any way bolster the reliability of Genesis, but rather emphatically demonstrates the mythic components of this creation story in Genesis 3. Jones says that Sodaf is another run-of-the-mill word for like a poisonous fiery serpent. But in 4 of its 5 usages in the Hebrew Bible, it is not at all clear that it has any actual run-of-the-mill application. On the contrary, the supernatural quality of these beings actually draw into serious doubt the historicity of texts like in Numbers 21, 6-8, where Moses must forge a magic snake idol in order to save the Israelites from the attack of otherworldly, flying, burning serpent creatures. The notion that the snakes in this passage are otherworldly beings is admittedly a minority view, but my point is this. The ambiguously mythic details scattered throughout the Hebrew Bible do not in any way help to rehabilitate its historical reliability. Rather, quite the opposite. These elements only serve to further confuse the matter, and they demonstrate how seamlessly the Bible writers and editors were able to weave myth into history. Jones spends the first few minutes of his presentation discussing the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, a complicated genealogy formed from at least 2 sources that illustrated Israel's relationship to its more distant neighbors and to the great powers of the ancient Near Eastern world, Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon.
We all know the Table of Nations. It's the part you don't read. You skip over that because that's boring. But if you actually get into some of the details here, there's a little bit of interesting data within the Table of Nations, which argues that it probably dates to early Bronze Age or middle or even middle Bronze Age. I'm talking the time of Abraham even.
Jones provides 7 key points, which he believes make his case. A few of these are so insignificant, they barely warrant any mention at all. For example, Jones thinks that the appearance of the cities Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 10:19 shows that the text here must be very early, because they were presumably destroyed around 1600 BCE. But then he fails also to mention references to these cities from later biblical texts in Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos 4:11, and Zephaniah 2:9. This amounts to a whole lot of "so what?" Jones also thinks the affiliation of the Philistines with the locale Casluhim rather than Caphtorim might reflect an earlier memory of their origins, but again, so what? Especially given the explicit mention of the Philistines, who did not arrive on the east coast of the Mediterranean until the very end of the 2nd millennium. Moreover, attempting to identify actual archaeological sites with place names like Sodom and Gomorrah or the incredibly obscure Casluhim is extremely problematic. Without even knowing where these places were, it's impossible to draw arguments from their supposed antiquity in support of the veracity of the Bible. Jones also points to the highlight of Aber as the ancestor of the Hebrews, and to the occurrence of Akkadian names as somehow meaningful here. I will talk about Akkadian later, but for now, it is important to note that these points don't actually provide any indication of a Bronze Age dating for the Table of Nations. While he highlights these aspects of antiquity, Jones completely ignores others. For example, he fails to account for Yavin in 10 verse 2, which first appears in Akkadian records from the 8th century BCE. Kittiim in 10 verse 4 as an identifier is also considerably late, appearing most prominently in biblical books Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and several 2nd or 1st century BCE texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, apart from these small errors, Jones goes on to make some sizable ones. In his treatment of the absence of the Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites from the table, his argument about the primacy of Sidon, and his point about the disassociation of the Medes from Persia.
First thing to note is it lacks mentions of Israel's later neighbors, like the Moabites, the Ammonites, the like in Edom. These were important for Israel in the first millennium BC. If you're going to do a survey of the surrounding nations, you'd think you would include these groups as well.
On the face of it, this sure sounds like a sensible point, but it actually betrays a huge oversight on Jones's part. Who were the Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites? These were neighboring peoples on the border of the Iron Age Israelite tribal confederacy. They were the closest related ethnic groups to those who identified themselves as the sons of Jacob or as Israelites. So, why is this a problem? Take a look at the so-called Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and ask yourself at the outset, where are the Israelites in this genealogy? Jones has drawn a chart that looks something like this as a means to illustrate his various points which follow. And we'll get back to this same chart when discussing the documenting hypothesis later. The table is an inventory of the descendants from Noah's three sons, Japhet in 10 verse 2 to 5, Ham in 10 6 to 20, and Shem in verses 21 to 31. While the sons of Israel descend from the line of Shem, this particular accounting of his offspring ends with the sons of Yoktan, verses 26 to 29, who was 4 generations removed from Shem. In Genesis 11, there is another genealogy. This one, considerably less complex, and with its focus set exclusively on the line of Shem, ending with Abraham, his brothers Haran and Nahor, and Haran's son Lot. Abraham's first appearance in Genesis does not occur until after a full 9 generations after Shem. Abraham's 2 sons are Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac's 2 sons are Jacob, the progenitor of the nation of Israel, and Esau, the patriarch of Edom. They were twins who are not mentioned until Genesis chapter 25. Moab and Ben-Ami, the father of the Ammonites, were born from the unsanctioned coitus between Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Lot's daughters, and this is not recorded until Genesis 19 verses 36 to 38. So, what is the problem here? Jones is arguing for the antiquity of the Table of Nations, from asking a question that the text was never in a position to answer, regardless of when it was written. Does the absence of Israel's later neighbors from this genealogy invalidate a post-Bronze Age dating for the text? Not in the slightest. The Iron Age sources of Genesis were telling a story, and the absence of Moab, Ammon, and Edom is completely uncontroversial because they had not yet emerged at this point in the arc of the narrative. In short, this is a non sequitur.
Another interesting point is that in the Table of Nations, Sidon is listed to represent the Phoenicians. Now this is interesting because Sidon was more of like the primary city for them in the second millennium BC, whereas in the first millennium, Tyre sort of becomes the more prominent city, and Tyre is missing in there.
One of the frustrating features of Jones's presentation is the absence of a lot of his source material. Yeah, he has provided some footnotes at the bottom of the screen where he presumably gleaned a lot of the information for this section, but this specific claim is a curious one, since it is patently false. There is every indication that Sidon was an active, thriving center of Phoenician rule and culture all the way through to the Babylonian expansion in 580 or 79 BCE, an incident that was mentioned by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 25:22 and 27:3. Jones asserts that Sidon's prominence was replaced by Tyre in the first millennium, yet there is ample evidence which invalidates this argument. 1 Kings 16:31 calls the Phoenician king at Baal the king of the Sidonians. 2 Kings 23:13 identifies Ashtoreth as the abomination of the Sidonians, which was included in Josiah's 7th century religious purge in Judea. The evidence is not just restricted to the biblical text. Sidon was remembered on Seleucid coins from the 3rd century BCE as the mother of Tyre. Sidon is remembered 17 times in the Homeric epics, all without the inclusion of Tyre. The 8th century Phoenician king Hiram, not the biblical Hiram, is called the king of Tyre in inscriptions belonging to Tiglath-Pileser III, but then is referred to in Cyprian inscriptions of the same period as the king of Sidon. Honestly, this is a completely vacuous point.
Another minor point, it mentions the Medes as a more prominent people group instead of calling them like the Persians and the Medes, which you would expect later given the Persian Empire.
I will talk a lot more shortly about how problematically Jones has set the parameters of his argument between either the Bronze Age or the post-Babylonian Persian period for the writing of Genesis, while he completely ignores the 600 or more years gap that separates them. Jones does go on to say,
now that could be consistent with a very early Iron Age, but it also fits with Bronze Age ideas.
This is a bewildering claim, since the Median kingdom is not known from any historical record prior to the 9th century BCE, and it was clearly decentralized until the 7th century. I'm reading here from the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Medes first appear in the Neo-Assyrian account of a military campaign in 835 BCE in central West Iran. Continuing references to West Iran in Assyrian documents from the 9th to the 7th centuries BCE show that the Medes were concentrated in central West Iran in the area of modern Kermanshah and along the high road leading to modern Hamadan. To the south lay the kingdom of Elipi, to the north the kingdom of Manea. It is clear that in the 9th and 8th century there is no unified kingdom of Media. The Assyrian texts speak of many small polities, which are of either mixed ethnic composition or primarily Median, but which were ruled by kings or tribal chiefs. The Median language documented in onomasticons, some place names, and loanwords in Persian is Old Northwest Iranian, possibly the ancestor of modern Kurdish. There is, however, evidence in cuneiform texts for growing Median political unity during the 7th century. If anything, this is a pretty straightforward indicator of a first millennium construction for the Table of Nations. There is a terminus a quo after the unification of the Medai in the 7th century, and a terminus ad quem before Cyrus the Great's conquest in the 6th century. But it's not just this single point about the Median kingdom. Evidence from other mentions of Sodom and Gomorrah in the biblical text point to a construction between the 8th and 6th centuries. Evidence from the mention of Sidon actually points to an 8th century construction. Several points of evidence seem to show rather clearly that the Table of Nations cannot have been composed at any point before the early 8th century BCE. I think that this catalog of errors on its own invalidates Michael Jones's overarching argument for the reliability and antiquity of Genesis, but there's more, a lot more. In the next video, I will show how Jones has stacked his case about Genesis on the basis of a serious false dichotomy, and how this plays into a straw man argument about scholarly opinions of the formation of Genesis. That's all for now.